The alarm screamed through the cargo bay as Lieutenant Kyle Morrison pressed himself against the cold metal wall. 3 meters away, the alien warrior stood over 7 feet tall, her crimson scales gleaming under the emergency lights. She held a plasma blade that hummed with lethal energy, and her yellow eyes tracked his every movement with predatory focus. Her name was Zara, a Korthian shock trooper, who had boarded the transport ship 5 minutes ago, with a dozen of her kind. The crew was dead. Kyle had watched them fall, one by one, as the Korthians tore through the vessel looking for the data core hidden somewhere in the cargo hold. He was the last human alive on this ship. Zara took a step forward, her armored boots clanging against the deck. She spoke in broken English, words she had learned from interrogating prisoners. "You hide. You run. Typical human weakness." Kyle said nothing. His hand rested on the hilt of the sword strapped to his hip. It was an old thing, a family heirloom his grandfather had given him before the war started. Steel blade, simple crossguard, leather-wrapped handle, worn smooth by generations of hands. In a universe of plasma weapons and energy shields, it seemed laughably primitive. Zara noticed it and laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the walls. "You bring knife to plasma fight? Your species is even more foolish than reports say." She raised her plasma blade, preparing to end this quickly. Kyle moved first. The sword cleared its sheath in a blur of motion. Kyle closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps, his blade sweeping up in an arc that caught Zara completely off guard. She barely managed to bring her plasma weapon down to block, and when steel met energy, something unexpected happened. The ancient blade didn't melt, it didn't shatter. The metal rang like a bell, and the plasma blade flickered, its energy disrupted by the impact. Zara's eyes widened. She stumbled back, reassessing the small human in front of her. Kyle pressed his advantage. He struck again, faster this time, his blade moving in patterns drilled into him since childhood. His grandfather had been a swordmaster, one of the few humans who still practiced the old combat arts. Kyle had trained for 20 years, every morning before dawn, every evening after duty. While other soldiers relied on their rifles and their armor, Kyle had learned something they had forgotten. Sometimes the oldest weapons were the deadliest. His blade found Zara's shoulder, cutting through a gap in her armor. She roared in pain and fury, swinging her plasma blade in a wide arc. Kyle ducked under it and rolled. Coming up behind her, he struck at her leg, and she went down on one knee. "Impossible," she hissed. "You are human. You are weak." Kyle circled her slowly, his sword held ready. "You spent so long fighting us with your technology that you forgot something important. We learned to kill long before we reached the stars." Zara's hand moved toward a device on her belt. Kyle recognized it immediately as a distress beacon. If she activated it, the other Korthians would come running. He had perhaps 30 seconds before this fight became unwinnable. He lunged forward, committing everything to one final strike. The blade caught Zara in the chest, piercing between 2 armor plates. She gasped, her hand falling away from the beacon. Her plasma blade clattered to the deck, its energy field dissipating. She looked up at Kyle with something that might have been respect in her dying eyes. "What are you?" she whispered. Kyle pulled his blade free and wiped it clean on her cloak. "Just a human with a sword." Zara slumped forward, dead before she hit the ground. Kyle moved through the ship's maintenance tunnels, his sword held low and ready. The passages were narrow, designed for repair crews, not combat. That gave him an advantage. The Korthians were larger, stronger, better armed, but in these cramped spaces, none of that mattered. Here, skill and speed determined who lived and who died. He could hear them searching the cargo bay above, their heavy footsteps reverberating through the metal deck plates. They had found Zara's body by now. They would be angry, confused, perhaps even frightened. Good. Fear made soldiers sloppy. The maintenance tunnel stretched ahead of him, dimly lit by emergency strips along the ceiling. Kyle's breathing was steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his system. His grandfather had drilled that into him during training. Control your breath, control your mind, control the fight. Every lesson from those early morning sessions came back to him now, as relevant in the depths of space as they had been in the dojo back on Earth. He thought about his grandfather briefly, wondering what the old man would say if he could see this. Probably something about proper form, or keeping his guard up. His grandfather had been harsh but fair, demanding excellence because he knew Kyle's life might depend on it someday. That day had arrived. The ship's layout was burned into Kyle's memory. He had studied the schematics during the flight, a habit that had seemed paranoid at the time but now proved invaluable. He knew every corridor, every junction, every hiding spot. The Korthians were operating blind, searching a maze they didn't understand. Kyle was hunting in his own territory. Kyle reached a junction and paused, listening carefully to the sounds filtering through the metal walls. Two sets of footsteps approached from his left, moving fast but without coordination. He pressed himself into an alcove and waited, controlling his breathing, slowing his heartbeat. His grandfather had taught him this too. Patience was as much a weapon as the blade. The Korthians were talking to each other in their guttural language. Kyle didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone. They were nervous. One of their best had fallen to a supposedly inferior opponent. That kind of death shook even the most hardened warriors. It made them question everything they thought they knew about combat, about themselves, about the enemy. Kyle could use that doubt. Fear and uncertainty were weapons as potent as any blade. If the Korthians were afraid, they would make mistakes. They would hesitate at critical moments. They would second-guess their training and their instincts. That hesitation would cost them their lives. The first Korthian rounded the corner, its rifle raised but its attention divided. Kyle exploded from his hiding spot with practiced efficiency. His sword took the alien in the throat before it could raise its weapon fully. The second one managed to fire, but the plasma bolt went wide, scorching the wall behind Kyle. He stepped inside the creature's guard and drove his blade up under its ribcage, between the armor plates where the protection was thinnest. Both aliens fell within seconds of each other, their blood pooling on the deck. Kyle cleaned his blade on one of their uniforms and took a moment to catch his breath. 2 down, 10 remaining. The odds were still terrible, but they were improving. He checked the corridor ahead, listening for more movement. The ship had gone quiet, except for the constant hum of the engines and the distant sound of the Korthians regrouping somewhere above him. He moved forward, keeping to the shadows. The maintenance tunnels connected to every major system on the ship. Kyle had access to power conduits, water lines, air filtration, waste processing. The Korthians controlled the main corridors and crew areas, but Kyle owned the ship's veins and arteries. That gave him options. Tactical advantages he could exploit. He found the next target in the engine room, trying to override the ship's navigation system. The Korthian was alone, confident in its technical skills, not expecting an attack. Kyle approached from behind, moving across the metal grating with the silence of a predator. The alien never heard him coming. His blade found the gap between helmet and chest plate, severing the spinal cord in one clean strike. The Korthian collapsed without a sound. Kyle dragged the body behind a power converter, where it wouldn't be immediately visible. 9 left. He was winning this war of attrition, but he was also getting tired. Every fight drained him a little more. The plasma burn on his arm throbbed with each heartbeat, and his muscles were starting to ache from the constant tension. He couldn't afford to slow down. The moment he stopped moving, the moment he gave the Korthians time to organize and plan, he would lose his advantage. He had to keep them off balance, keep them scared, keep them dying one by one, until there were none left. The ship's intercom crackled to life, making Kyle freeze in place. A voice spoke in the Korthian language, harsh and commanding. Kyle didn't understand the specific words, but he understood the intent. Their commander was rallying them, ordering them to hunt in packs, to stay together for mutual protection. Smart thinking. That would make things significantly more difficult. Kyle would have to adapt. If they wanted to group up, he would force them to split apart again. He accessed a maintenance panel and triggered the fire suppression system in the medical bay on the opposite side of the ship. Alarms blared throughout the vessel, and he heard the Corthians shouting to each other in confusion and alarm. 3 of them broke off from the main group to investigate the emergency. Exactly as Kyle had hoped, he intercepted them in the corridor outside the medical bay. The fight was brutal and fast, nothing like the controlled duels of the training hall. These were real warriors fighting for their lives, and they were good at it. Kyle moved with practiced economy, his blade finding gaps in armor, weak points in their defenses. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind with each strike. Don't fight their strength, fight their weaknesses. Every warrior has them, no matter how skilled or well-armed. 2 Corthians died in the first explosive exchange. The third one was faster, more experienced, a veteran who had survived dozens of battles. It managed to wound Kyle, a plasma bolt grazing his left arm. The pain was immediate and intense, like being branded with hot metal. Kyle used it, let it sharpen his focus rather than dulling it. Pain was just another sensation, another piece of information to process and overcome. He feinted high toward the Corthian's head, drawing its guard up, then struck low toward its knee. The blade cut through the joint mechanism in the armor, and the alien stumbled. Kyle pressed forward and drove his sword up into the exposed area under its arm. The Corthian's eyes went wide with shock, then empty. It fell backward, and Kyle pulled his blade free. 6 left. But Kyle was bleeding. The burn on his arm was serious. Charred flesh that would need medical attention soon. He tore a strip of cloth from his uniform and tied it tight around the wound, gritting his teeth against the fresh wave of pain. The makeshift bandage would have to do until he finished this. He checked his sword. The blade was still sharp, still true, despite everything he had put it through. The old steel was holding up better than modern alloys would have in the same circumstances. There was something to be said for traditional craftsmanship, for weapons made by masters who understood that a blade wasn't just a tool, but an extension of the warrior who wielded it. Kyle moved toward the bridge, taking a longer route through the service corridors. The remaining Corthians had gathered there. He could hear their voices filtering through the ventilation system. They were arguing about what to do next. Some wanted to continue searching for the data core. Others wanted to retreat and call for reinforcements. They had lost 7 warriors to a single human, armed with primitive technology. That kind of casualty rate was unprecedented in their military history. Good. Let them be afraid. Let them understand that humans were more dangerous than their intelligence reports had suggested. Let them learn the hard way that size and strength and advanced weapons didn't guarantee victory. Skill mattered. Determination mattered. The will to fight when the odds were impossible mattered most of all. Kyle found an access panel that led directly into the bridge. He used a welding torch from a nearby repair kit to cut through the electronic lock, working slowly and quietly so the sound wouldn't carry. When the panel came free, he set it aside carefully and peered through the opening into the bridge beyond. 6 Corthians stood in a defensive formation around the captain's chair. Their commander was the largest, his armor decorated with kill markings and battle honors. He held a heavy plasma rifle, and his eyes constantly scanned the bridge, looking for threats. The other 5 were positioned to cover all the entrances, their weapons ready, their posture tense. Kyle studied the scene and calculated his options. A direct assault would be suicide. Even with surprise on his side, 6 trained warriors with energy weapons would cut him down before he could reach them. The cramped corridors had favored him before. But the bridge was an open space with clear lines of fire. He needed a different approach, something they wouldn't expect. His eyes fell on the environmental control systems built into the bridge's rear wall. Every ship carried backup air supplies in case of hull breach or life support failure. Those supplies were stored in high-pressure tanks, and the release valves could be triggered manually if the automated systems failed. Kyle studied the control panel and began to form a plan. It was risky, It was probably insane, but it might work, and at this point, that was good enough. He backed away from the access panel and made his way through the service corridors to the main oxygen storage compartment. The tanks were massive cylinders of compressed gas, each one containing enough air to fill the entire ship several times over. Kyle found the manual override controls and began turning the valve, slowly increasing the pressure in the bridge's air circulation system. At first, nothing happened. The changes were too gradual for the Corthians to notice immediately, but as Kyle continued to increase the pressure, the atmosphere in the bridge became thicker, heavier. Breathing became more difficult. The Corthians began to notice something was wrong. Their commander barked orders, sending 2 of his warriors to check the environmental systems and find out what was malfunctioning. Kyle was waiting for them when they arrived at the maintenance junction. His sword sang through the air, and 2 more aliens fell to the deck. 4 left now. But Kyle was running out of time. The commander would realize what was happening soon, and he would find a way to equalize the pressure or evacuate the bridge. Kyle had to move fast. He ran back toward the bridge, his wounded arm throbbing with each step. The pain was getting worse, and he could feel blood seeping through the makeshift bandage. He pushed the discomfort aside and focused on what needed to be done. Pain was temporary. Failure was permanent. The Corthians had figured out the pressure problem and were trying to override the environmental controls from the bridge console. Kyle reached the access panel and pulled himself through, emerging onto the bridge behind a bank of navigation equipment. The 4 remaining aliens spotted him immediately. Plasma fire erupted across the bridge. Kyle dove behind a control console as energy bolts burned through the air where he had been standing. He rolled to his right and came up moving, his sword in hand, closing the distance before they could adjust their aim. The first Corthian went down with Kyle's blade through its throat. The second one swung its rifle like a club, trying to batter Kyle aside. He ducked under the swing and hamstrung the alien with a quick slash. It fell, and Kyle finished it with a thrust to the chest. 2 left. The commander and 1 other warrior. They had positioned themselves on opposite sides of the bridge, creating a crossfire that would be almost impossible to survive. Kyle needed to even the odds, quickly. He spotted the emergency airlock controls near the bridge entrance and made a desperate decision. He sprinted toward the controls, plasma bolts tracking his movement. 1 scored a hit on his leg, and he nearly fell. He caught himself on a railing and kept moving, his hand slamming down on the emergency release. The outer airlock door blew open with a thunderous roar. Atmosphere screamed out of the bridge in a violent rush. Equipment not bolted down became projectiles, flying toward the void. The 2 Corthians scrambled for handholds, their weapons forgotten as they fought against the hurricane-force winds. Kyle had anchored himself to a support beam the moment before hitting the release. He held on with his good arm, his body horizontal in the rushing wind, waiting for the right moment. The younger warrior lost its grip and tumbled past him toward the airlock. The commander was stronger. His claws dug deep into the captain's chair, holding on despite the impossible forces trying to tear him away. Kyle pulled himself hand over hand along the support beam, fighting toward the commander. The wind tore at him, tried to rip him free, but he held on. His grandfather's training had included exercises in moving under difficult conditions, maintaining balance and control when everything around you was chaos. Those lessons saved his life now. He reached the commander just as the alien's grip began to fail. Their eyes met, and Kyle saw something unexpected there. Not fear or hatred, but a kind of respect. Recognition that Kyle had won, that humanity had proven more dangerous than anyone had believed possible. Kyle raised his sword for the final strike. The commander made no move to defend himself. Perhaps he was too tired. Perhaps he had accepted his fate. Perhaps he simply understood that there was no defense against what was coming. The blade fell. The commander's grip loosened. He tumbled backward into the airlock and disappeared into the void beyond. The emergency systems sealed the airlock automatically once the pressure differential stabilized. Kyle hung from the support beam for a long moment, gasping for breath in the thin air that remained. His arm was bleeding heavily now, and his leg wound had joined it. He was lightheaded, from blood loss and oxygen deprivation, but he had won. He was alive, and they were dead. Kyle lowered himself to the deck and activated the emergency oxygen supplies. Fresh air flooded the bridge, and he breathed deeply, letting his racing heart slow. The ship's systems were damaged but still functional. The navigation controls responded to his input. He could fly her. He could complete the mission. He made his way to the cargo bay, each step an exercise in willpower. The data core was exactly where it should be, hidden in a sealed compartment behind a bulkhead panel. Kyle retrieved it and clutched it to his chest. This small device contained information that could change the course of the war. Fleet movements, supply routes, communication codes. Thousands of human lives had been sacrificed to obtain this intelligence. Kyle set course for the nearest human outpost and engaged the faster-than-light drive. As the ship made the jump, reality twisting around it, Kyle collapsed into the captain's chair. His vision was blurring, his body shutting down from exhaustion and blood loss. He triggered a distress beacon that would guide any human ships to his location once he dropped out of faster-than-light travel. Then he allowed himself to rest. He had done his duty. The mission was complete. Whether he survived to see the outcome didn't matter as much as ensuring the data reached command. His sword lay across his lap, the blade still stained with alien blood, still sharp after cutting through armor and bone. Kyle thought about Zara in those final moments before consciousness faded. She had asked him what he was, and he had told her he was just a human with a sword. But that wasn't quite accurate. He was proof of something the galaxy needed to understand. Humanity wasn't weak simply because they were smaller or less technologically advanced. They were survivors who had clawed their way up from primitive beginnings, who had faced extinction dozens of times and refused to die. They were warriors in the truest sense. Not because they loved violence, but because they understood that some things were worth fighting for. Freedom, dignity, the right to exist without bowing to those who considered themselves superior. Kyle carried all of that in his blood, in his training, in the sword his grandfather had passed down to him. The ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel 3 days later. Kyle regained consciousness to find a human medical team surrounding him, working frantically to stabilize his condition. The outpost commander stood nearby, holding the data core, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. Kyle tried to speak, to report on the mission, but his throat was too dry. A medic held water to his lips, and he drank gratefully. "Rest," the commander said. "You've done more than enough. The intelligence you brought us is invaluable." "How did you survive against an entire Korthian boarding party?" Kyle's hand found his sword, still strapped to his side even after everything. The medics had cleaned the blade while he was unconscious, restoring it to gleaming brightness. He managed a weak smile. "Training," he whispered. "And a good blade." Word of Kyle's survival and victory spread through the human fleet like wildfire. The story of one man defeating 12 Korthian warriors with nothing but an ancient sword captured the imagination of every soldier who heard it. Command was skeptical at first. They demanded proof, verification, evidence that the tale wasn't exaggerated. The ship's security recordings provided that evidence. Officers watched in stunned silence as Kyle moved through the corridors, his movements precise and economical, his blade finding targets with practiced accuracy. They watched him fight with a skill that seemed impossible in the modern era, where warfare had become a matter of point and click, of targeting systems and guided munitions. What Kyle had done belonged to an earlier age, when combat was personal and skill mattered more than technology. Yet here it was, recorded and verified, proof that the old ways still had value. The data core proved to be everything Command had hoped for, and more. The intelligence it contained led to a series of successful operations against Korthian supply lines and fleet concentrations. Hundreds of human lives were saved because of the information Kyle had protected. The war's momentum began to shift in humanity's favor. While Kyle recovered in the medical bay, Something unexpected began to happen across human space. Soldiers started seeking out old weapons, swords, and knives their ancestors had carried. Training programs opened, teaching combat forms that had been considered obsolete for generations. The ancient martial arts experienced a renaissance as warriors realized that Kyle's victory hadn't been a fluke. It was a demonstration of principles that remained valid regardless of technological advancement. Skill beat strength when properly applied. Speed and precision could overcome raw power. A warrior who understood distance and timing could defeat an opponent with superior equipment. These weren't new truths. They were ancient wisdom that humanity had nearly forgotten in its rush toward the future. Kyle watched this transformation from his hospital bed, reading reports and watching news feeds. He saw young soldiers practicing sword forms, their movements awkward at first, but gradually improving. He saw veterans taking up blades for the first time, determined to add this skill to their arsenal. He saw a shift in how humanity viewed itself and its place in the galaxy. For too long, humans had accepted that they were the underdogs, the weaker species trying to survive in a hostile universe. They had relied on cunning and technology to compensate for their physical limitations. But Kyle's victory had reminded them of something important. Humans weren't weak. They were different, and that difference could be an advantage rather than a handicap. The Korthians had assumed that physical size and advanced technology determined the outcome of battles. They had paid a terrible price for that assumption. Zara and her team had walked onto that transport, expecting an easy mission. They had found something that terrified them instead. They had found proof that humanity was far more dangerous than their intelligence reports had suggested. Other species began to take notice. Reports of the sword warrior who killed 12 Korthians spread beyond human space. Ambassadors asked questions. Military analysts studied the security footage. Everyone wanted to understand how a supposedly primitive human had achieved something that should have been impossible. Kyle gave them the answer when he finally returned to active duty. He stood before a gathering of reporters and military officials, his arm still healing but his spirit unbroken. When they asked him to explain his victory, he kept his response simple. The Korthians underestimated us because we're smaller and less advanced. They forgot that we've been fighting for survival since before we could speak. Every human carries the legacy of 1,000,000 years of warfare in their genes. We learned to hunt predators that were bigger and stronger than us. We learned to survive in environments that should have killed us. We learned to adapt and overcome no matter what the universe threw at us. He drew his sword, the blade catching the light. This weapon is thousands of years old in design, but the principles behind it are timeless. Distance, timing, leverage, speed, these things don't change. A warrior who understands them will always be dangerous. Regardless of what weapons they carry, he sheathed the sword. The Korthians had better technology, but we had better warriors. That made all the difference. The speech was recorded and broadcast across human space. It became a rallying cry for the war effort, a reminder that humanity had strengths their enemies didn't understand or appreciate. Recruitment numbers surged. Training programs expanded. The sword warriors, as they came to be known, grew from a handful of enthusiasts to an entire division of specialized troops. Kyle trained many of them personally. He taught them what his grandfather had taught him: the importance of fundamentals, the value of discipline and practice, the need to understand not just how to use a weapon, but why it worked. He was harder on them than his grandfather had been on him, because he knew that any weakness in their training could mean death in combat. His students responded to the challenge. They trained in the early mornings before their regular duties. They sparred with each other, pushing themselves to improve, competing to see who could master the forms most quickly. They were creating a new warrior tradition, one that honored the past while serving the present. The war continued. The Korthians, shocked by their losses, adapted their tactics. They began treating humans with more caution, more respect. They stopped assuming that technological superiority guaranteed victory. They learned, as so many had learned before them, that underestimating humanity was a fatal mistake. Human forces pushed forward, reclaiming lost territory, winning battles that had seemed unwinnable months before. The sword warriors led many of these assaults, boarding enemy ships with blades drawn, fighting in close quarters where their training gave them an almost unfair advantage. They turned the Korthians' technological edge into a liability, forcing battles into conditions where skill mattered more than firepower. Kyle fought in the front lines of this offensive. He led boarding parties onto enemy vessels, his sword cutting through Korthian warriors like his grandfather's blade had cut through practice targets decades ago. He was wounded repeatedly, each time returning to duty as soon as the medical staff would clear him. He lost friends and students, young warriors who had shown such promise but died before they could fully mature as fighters. Each loss hurt. Each funeral made Kyle question whether he was doing the right thing, whether teaching young people to fight with swords was giving them an advantage, or just ensuring they died in close combat instead of at range. But then he would see them in action, would watch them move with confidence and skill, would witness them defeating opponents that should have killed them. And he knew the training was worth it. The sword wasn't a gimmick or a psychological weapon. It was a legitimate tool of war, effective in the right hands, under the right circumstances. Kyle's students proved that in battle after battle. They weren't fighting with swords because it looked impressive. They fought with swords because swords worked. The Korthians eventually sued for peace. Their empire was in ruins, their military shattered by years of defeats they hadn't thought possible. The treaty negotiations were long and difficult, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Humanity had proven it could not be conquered, not by superior numbers, not by advanced technology, not by any force the Korthians could bring to bear. On the day the peace treaty was signed, Kyle stood on the observation deck of a human carrier and looked out at the stars. He was older now, scarred by dozens of battles, no longer the young lieutenant who had faced Zara in that cargo bay. But his sword was the same. His grandfather's blade, still sharp, still deadly, still serving its purpose after all these years. Somewhere out there, on Korthian worlds, warriors told stories about the human with the sword. They told their younglings about Zara, the shock trooper who had underestimated a human and paid with her life. They told them about the boarding party that never returned, killed one by a warrior who refused to die. The stories had taken on mythical qualities, exaggerated perhaps, but rooted in truth. Kyle hoped those stories would serve as a warning, not a threat, but a reminder that humanity deserved respect, that size and strength didn't determine worth, that even the smallest species could be dangerous if you pushed them hard enough. He hoped that the next time someone looked at a human and saw weakness, they would remember Zara's last question. What are you? We are human, Kyle thought. We are survivors. We are warriors. We are proof that determination and skill can overcome any obstacle. We are the species that refuses to surrender, that adapts and overcomes, that finds a way to win even when victory seems impossible. We are not the strongest or the fastest or the most advanced, but we are the ones who are still here, still fighting, still standing when everyone else has fallen or given up. That has to count for something. His communicator buzzed. New orders. Reports of pirate attacks on colony ships in the frontier sectors. Command wanted the sword warriors deployed to investigate and neutralize the threat. Kyle checked his blade and headed for the hangar bay. The war with the Korthians was over, but there would always be new threats, new enemies, who needed to learn the same lesson. He would teach them, one blade strike at a time, until the message was clear to every species in the galaxy. Humanity was not prey. They were predators who had learned to hunt among the stars. His students were already assembled in the hangar, checking their equipment, preparing for deployment. They wore their swords with pride, viewing them not as antiques, but as symbols of everything they had learned. They represented a new generation of warriors, trained in methods both ancient and modern, equally comfortable with a plasma rifle or a steel blade. Kyle addressed them briefly before boarding the transport. He kept his words simple, as his grandfather had always done. Stay sharp. Stay focused. Remember your training. And come home alive. They saluted him, and he saluted back. Then, they boarded the transport and lifted off, heading toward whatever awaited them in the frontier. Kyle settled into his seat and closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of his sword against his hip. This was what he was meant to do, not because he loved war, but because he understood that sometimes the only way to preserve peace was to be ready for battle. His grandfather had known that. Every warrior who had carried this blade before him had known it. Now Kyle knew it too, and he would pass that knowledge on to the next generation, ensuring that humanity never forgot the lessons of the past. The transport accelerated toward the jump point. Kyle opened his eyes and looked at his reflection in the viewport. He saw a warrior looking back, scarred but unbroken, tired but determined. He saw someone who had faced impossible odds and survived. He saw proof that humanity belonged among the stars, not as servants or victims, but as equals. To Zara, he had been just a frail human. To the galaxy, he had become something more. He was a reminder of what humans were capable of when pushed to their limits. He was proof that the old ways still had value in the modern age. He was a bridge between humanity's violent past and its uncertain future. But most importantly, he was a warrior doing his duty. Nothing more, nothing less. That was enough. That had always been enough. The transport jumped to faster than light speed, carrying Kyle and his students toward their next mission. The sword at his hip had been forged centuries ago by hands that never imagined space travel or alien empires. Yet here it was, still relevant, still deadly, still serving the same purpose it had always served, protecting those who could not protect themselves, striking down those who threatened the innocent, reminding the universe that humanity would never surrender, never bow, never accept defeat. That was the legacy Kyle carried. That was the tradition he upheld. That was the lesson he would teach to anyone who made the mistake of thinking humans were weak, and he would keep teaching it, keep fighting, keep proving that humanity deserved its place among the stars, until the day he could no longer lift his blade. That day had not yet come. Until it did, Kyle Morrison would remain what he had always been: a warrior, a teacher, a symbol of everything that made humanity dangerous. Just a human with a sword, nothing more, nothing less. But sometimes, that was all you needed to change the galaxy.